and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate music and the making of Portugal and Spain, nationalism and identity politics in the Iberian Peninsula. My name is Heather, and I'm the Senior Publicity Manager at the University of Illinois Press, and I'm just going to go over some brief logistical information and introduce our guests before we get started. First of all, thank you so much to our panelists for being here today. They're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for a 15-minute Q&A at the end. You can enter questions throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. A 50% off discount code and a link to the book on our website can be found in the chat box. I'll put it in there after I finish speaking. We will also be recording the event and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. You'll receive an email from Zoom after the event that will have both the discount code and a link to our YouTube channel as well. And now I will just briefly introduce our guests. Machin-Autenrieth is a lecturer in ethnomusicology at the University of Aberdeen. His research focuses on flamenco, regional identity, heritage studies, post-colonial studies, and Hispano-Moroccan musical exchanges. He is the author of Flamenco, Regionalism, and Musical Heritage in Southern Spain. Salwa el-Shawan Castelo-Branco is Professor Emerita of Ethnomusicology at the Universidade Nova de Lisboa in Portugal. She has held a variety of positions throughout her career at Columbia, Princeton, the University of Chicago, St. John's College, Cambridge, and University of California, Berkeley. She carried out field research in Portugal, Egypt, and Oman, resulting in publications on cultural politics, musical nationalism, identity, music media, modernity, heritagization, and music and conflict. Recent publications include Transforming Ethnomusicology and Portugal and Spain, Experiencing Music, Expressing Culture. Samuel Llano is a senior lecturer in Spanish cultural studies at the University of Manchester. He specializes in the music and sound cultures of Spain from a transcultural perspective. He is the author of Who's Spain? Negotiating Spanish Music in Paris, 1908 through 1929, and Discordant Notes, Marginality and Social Control in Madrid, 1850 to 1930. He is currently writing a book titled The Empire of the Ear, Music, Race, and the Sonic Architecture of Colonial Morocco. Kimberly Holton is a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies at Rutgers University, Newark. Holton researches expressive culture in the Portuguese-speaking world, focusing on the intersection between politics, performance, and migration. Holton is the author of Performing Folklore, Ranchos Folclóricos from Lisbon to Newark, and co-editor with Andrea Klimt on Community, Culture, and the Makings of Identity, Portuguese Americans along the Eastern Seaboard. Holton is the founder and director of the Ironbound Oral History Project and is currently at work on a book about fado performance in the US. Michael Christoforidis is a professor in musicology at the Melbourne Conservatorium of Music, University of Melbourne. He has published extensively on 19th and 20th century Spanish music and dance and its impact on Western culture. Other research interests include the impact of the visual arts upon musical modernism, issues of national identity and exoticism in music, and the history of the acoustic guitar. He has published 2 monographs, Manual de Follow and Visions of Spanish Music, and Carmen and the Staging of Spain. Michael is not able to join us today due to the time zones, but we will play a pre-recorded message from him. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists. Thanks again to everyone for being here today.
Thanks ever so much, Heather, for the introduction. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be tuning in from. My name is Machin-Autenrieth, and it's a pleasure to be able to welcome you to this virtual book launch for our volume, Music and the Making of Portugal and Spain, Nationalism and Identity Politics in the Iberian Peninsula, which was officially published on the 24th of October in physical, and also we're delighted to say open access versions as well. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes just to give a little bit of background to the edited volume, how it emerged, its rationale, contributions, and so on. I'll then pass over to Salwa and Samuel, my wonderful co-editors. And then we're delighted to have, as part of this book, 2 esteemed scholars in the field, as Heather has said, Kimberly Holton from Rutgers University and Michael Christoforidis from Melbourne, who will both speak for about 5 to 10 minutes to give their perspectives on the book as outside experts in Portuguese music studies and Spanish music studies, respectively. As Heather's noted, unfortunately, due to the time difference, Michael won't be able to join us. I think it's about 4 o'clock in the morning over there, but he has recorded a short video which we can play at the end. Now, as is courtesy with any book launch, and given the huge amount of work that goes into edited volumes, I'd just like to begin by saying a series of thank yous before moving on to my sort of broader contextualization of the volume. First to Heather Gurnentz from the University of Illinois Press for putting together and promoting this particular book launch. Also to the whole publishing team at Illinois, who have been fantastic in helping us along the process and working patiently with us over this text for so many years, considering that we really began in about 2018, so it's quite a long time coming. Also thanks to the amazing contributing authors who have worked so hard to submit their excellent chapters. It's been a pleasure to work with you all and to see this volume gradually coming together. Also a big thank you to Kimberly and to Michael for participating in the event and enriching this conversation. And finally, and by no means least, I'd like to extend a personal note of thanks to my wonderful co-editors, Salwa and Samuel. It's been an amazing experience working with you, learning from you, and watching this volume grow together. Now, of course, I'm delighted with the final product, but I will also cherish the fond memories and experiences of bringing this volume together with two such fine scholars. So this book, as I say, has been a long time coming. It dates to a symposium that I organised in collaboration with Salwa and Samuel, and as well as two other scholars working on Spanish music, Susana Moreno Fernandez and Cassandra Barroso Badan. The symposium was entitled Music, Nation and Region in the Iberian Peninsula, Resounding History, Identity and Heritage. And it took place in June 2017 at the University of Cambridge as part of my Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship at the time. This was a postdoctoral research grant. We had a range of scholars from across disciplines such as ethnomusicology, musicology, popular music studies, anthropology, and the symposium examined the ways in which different music genres in the Iberian Peninsula have been and continue to be caught up with debates around national and regional identity. Following the event, Samuel and I decided to move forward with the book project from the symposium with a combination of expanded papers from the event and also invited contributors. Now, in preparing any book proposal, the first stage, of course, is to refine and to consider in more depth the rationale for the book and the gaps in scholarship that we wanted to address beyond what the symposium was able to achieve. Now, while there is a rich scholarship in Spanish and Portuguese music studies on issues to do with national music, canon and nationalism, much of this work is focused on national composers, so that is in art music, or the traditional heavyweights, we might say, of fado and flamenco. We wanted to offer a volume which considered other aspects of music making in the peninsula that may have received less attention: popular music, folk, anthems, music and sound's role in political protest, and so on. And so a unique angle in the book is the in-depth analysis of the mobilization of popular music and other genres in understanding and challenging national identity politics, something that has received far less attention in music scholarship on the Iberian Peninsula. Now, when considering music studies more broadly, the Iberian Peninsula has been relatively neglected when considering debates and theories around nationalism for multiple reasons, and including, most importantly, a tendency amongst musicologists and historians to focus on Central Europe as the birthplace of the very concept of nation and nationalism from the 18th century. As such, a key rationale for this book is to recenter the Iberian Peninsula in conversations around music, nation, and heritage in Europe more widely, in a body of scholarship dominated by Central Europe. When we set out to edit the book, we felt, and we still do, that the Iberian Peninsula provides a suitable context for exploring current debates around music's role in nationalism and heritage. Since the 19th century, music making in Portugal and Spain has been intertwined with shifting debates regarding national identity. Musicians and music scholars have been active agents in these debates, where different genres have been implicated in the construction and the contestation of national ideologies according to distinct political and historical moments. Both countries share similar political histories, experience of authoritarian regimes, close relationships between folklore and national ideology, and comparable geopolitical and economic relations with the rest of Europe. Therefore, the Iberian Peninsula is a particularly productive site for examining how music making and the influence of local, regional, and international factors might nuance our understanding of nationalism. By bringing together scholars working on specific case studies, the ultimate aim then of the book is to offer a transcultural and an interdisciplinary approach to music's relationship with themes common to both Portugal and Spain, such as dictatorship, state ideology, heritageization, political protest, and nationalism or regionalism. To finish this little introduction, I'd just like to give a sense of the structure of the text and what we feel as editors some of its main contributions are. The book is organised thematically into 4 sections that cut across different genres and time periods from the late 19th century. In the first section, music, state propaganda, and authoritarian regimes, the authors look at music's role as a form of nationalist propaganda. In the second section, sound technologies and the nation, the chapters examine how recording industries were implicated in and contributed to the mediatization of identities in the Iberian Peninsula. The third section, negotiating the state, nation, and region, examines how music has served alternative visions of national identity, especially through the transition to democracy periods in both countries and in the context of subnational regional identities. And in the final section, musical heritageization and the state, the chapters consider the impact of national and international heritage regimes on policies of safeguarding and musical sustainability. To the best of our knowledge, this is the first book of its kind to approach both Portugal and Spain in conjunction, drawing together scattered scholarship and opening new lines of inquiry that will shed light on the dynamics of music and nationalism in the Iberian Peninsula. To stress again, a unique feature of the volume, we feel, is its diversity in terms of music genre cutting across art, folk, and popular music. The diversity of subject matter covered in the volume moves beyond the tendency in current scholarship to focus on fado and flamenco as the iconic traditions of Portugal and Spain, 2 traditions that receive limited attention in the book. We have sought to build a multi-scale analysis which moves beyond methodological nationalism. Many of the chapters explore how intersecting local, subnational, regional, national, and supranational scales can nuance our understanding of music and nationalism in the Iberian Peninsula. And most importantly for us as editors, the book has provided a space for Portuguese and Spanish authors to publish their work in English, allowing the international research community to have access to unique and specialized research previously often only available in Portuguese and Spanish. Indeed, all the fantastic contributors to this volume come from or have lived for many years in Portugal and Spain. I think it's only me who is the cultural outsider. So I'll leave it there as my introduction, and I'll pass over to Salwa, sorry. Thanks ever so much, and I look forward to the Q&A. Salwa, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. I'm Salwa el-Shawan Castelo-Branco, and I'm Professor Emerita at the Nova University of Lisbon, as was said. I'm also President Emerita of the Ethnomusicology Institute, Center for Studies in Music and Dance at the same university. As co-editor of this volume, I begin also by thanking Illinois University Press team, and in particular Heather, for their wonderful work in bringing us through different stages in the preparation of this volume. Of course, my many thanks to the authors. We've been relentless, the 3 of us, in demanding changes and refinements and so forth, and everyone responded wonderfully to all what we requested. And of course, last but not least, working with Matthew and Samuel on the design and preparation of this volume was not only stimulating and exciting, but just a sheer pleasure. Each of us brought our editorial experience, our writing styles, and our distinct and complementary research experiences and perspectives. I really, truly miss working with you, and I'm ready for another one. Our work on this volume privileged a dialogical approach, interweaving themes, issues, and transdisciplinary perspectives that have been central in the understanding of music and the construction of nation and region across both Iberian countries, from the late 19th century up to the present. By focusing on music in Portugal and Spain, we aimed at contributing to the growing transdisciplinary literature, which unfortunately does not include music in most cases, that has addressed the diverse and yet intersecting histories, identities, cultural politics, and expressive practices in both Iberian countries. In Portugal and Spain, music and nation building has been addressed by several historical musicologists, ethnomusicologists, historians, and cultural anthropologists. The editors and authors, we certainly all drew on this important work. However, we feel that this volume brings a fresh transdisciplinary perspective to the conversation, addressing the centrality of the media, especially the recording technology and radio, where local and transnational networks intersect. We also addressed, as Matthew said, several genres of popular music, as well as cultural politics during Salazar's and Franco's authoritarian rule and in democracy, and finally, heritage making and the impact of UNESCO's intangible cultural heritage paradigm on expressive practices and their sustainability, among several other themes. Most of the chapters were written, as Matthew said, not only by scholars who live and work in the Iberian Peninsula, but also who represent a new generation who, in fact, many of whom were trained in academic programs in universities in Portugal and Spain, where historical musicology and ethnomusicology were institutionalized starting in the 1980s. Their contribution to this volume reflects the development of music research in both countries, in several universities and research centers where the author studies and/or hold faculty in Portugal, Lisbon, with 2 research centers, the Ethnomusicology Institute, Center for Studies in Music and Dance, and the Center for the Study of Music and the Sociology and Aesthetics of Music. And in Spain, the Complutense University of Madrid, the universities of Oviedo, Valladolid, Granada, Seville, and Cordoba, as well as the Spanish Research Council, TESIC, and the Institute for Heritage Studies, among others. The volume also reflects the increasing cooperation between music scholars and scholarly organizations in both Iberian countries. For example, scholars from Portugal regularly participate in the annual meetings of SEDEM, the Spanish Society for Ethnomusicology, and CIBE, and vice versa. Scholars from Spain regularly participate in the conferences of SPIM, the Portuguese Society for Music Research. In fact, 2 of CIBE's conferences were organized and held in Portugal by the University of Nova of Lisbon and by the Aveiro University. There's also an increasing number of joint publications and edited volumes, like, for example, my volume with Susana Moreno Fernandes, Music in Portugal and Spain, Experiencing Music, Expressing Culture, published by OUP, and the edited volume in Portuguese and Spanish, which in an English translation of the title is entitled Other Celts, Celticism, Modernity and Global Music in Portugal and Spain, which was published by Tinta de China and edited by myself, by Susana Moreno Fernandes and Antonio Medeiros. I hope that the critical perspectives focusing on music in Iberian geographies and historical trajectories, much of which are made available in English language for the first time, will contribute with fresh insights on the multiple ways in which nation and region are imagined and contested through music, especially in moments of political upheaval and societal transformation. I also hope that this volume inspires the continuation of fruitful cooperation between scholars in both Iberian countries and beyond. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for attending and supporting this event. My name is Samuel Llano, and I am an associate professor of Spanish Cultural Studies at the University of Manchester. Well, I am a little bit the odd one out in the team of co-editors, both because I am based in a different discipline, even though my background is in musicology, because I am a historical musicologist rather than an ethnomusicologist, although all 3 of us in the editorial team in this volume cross boundaries between disciplines and approaches constantly. So by stating this, I do not mean to single myself out, but rather to justify that my brief talk today will be focused on highlighting what I hope this book may contribute to the field of Hispanic studies. So let me start by saying that this is not a book about the music of Portugal and Spain, if by that we understand a collection of essays on the musical cultures of both countries, even if that's what it looks like. This is a book that uses case studies some of them comparative, to help its readers rethink the different cultural tensions and relationships developing in the Iberian Peninsula from the late 19th century onwards. Portugal and Spain are two inevitable realities in this type of inquiry, as they are the two dominant states. But our book certainly transcends them by looking at other cultural formations and the tensions that develop below, beyond, and above state borders. To illustrate my point in more detail, I shall read out a few words from the introduction that address this particular question. This book follows music in the Iberian Peninsula across its different journeys to and from the local, regional, national, European, and global. This task is not without its challenges. Recent debates about the goals and identity of Iberian studies have shed light on some of the epistemological and methodological challenges faced by this academic field. Joan Ramon Resina warns that the study of the cultures of the Iberian Peninsula could lead to a bicephalic confusion of the peninsula with two sovereignties. In view of this hazard, our book considers the realities and movements that challenge the state and that break down the binary of Portugal-Spain. Second, there is a risk that in studying the region in relation to the state, not only is another binary reinforced, but the state also becomes the sole prism through which all regional and national realities are analyzed. The mutual support that Catalan and Portuguese nationalisms have found in each other, the mirroring and mutual borrowing of nationalist tropes between Portugal and Galicia, or the rise of pro-federalist tendencies in the Iberian Peninsula from the late 19th century onwards, are all indications that a complex web of interests has existed for at least the last 2 centuries. These different movements have been united by the fact that Castilian rule was seen as a threat to the survival of other Iberian cultures and a burden to the future of Spain. Finally, the study of cultural diversity in Spain and Portugal would give rise to a tokenist view that celebrates diversity without considering the power relations and asymmetries lying below its surface. To avoid fetishizing the diverse cultures of Spain and Portugal, this book does not directly compare between them. Comparison normally relies on categories of knowledge and systems of values produced by the one who compares. Cultures are not discrete units that can be compared, but changing modalities that engage with one another in diverse ways. Different territories of the Iberian Peninsula are not considered as specimens of a preconceived idea of nation or region, but rather as changing realities. Likewise, musical practices in the Portuguese and Spanish nations and regions are not compared on equal terms, but rather as contingent upon shifting and mutually influencing social and political processes that problematize the very idea of music and its relationship with territoriality. Notwithstanding these challenges, Portugal and Spain share similar political histories, experience of authoritarian regimes, links between folklore and national ideology, the tourist exploitation of fado and flamenco, the uses of protest song, and comparable geopolitical and economic relations with the rest of Europe. Therefore, the Iberian Peninsula is a particularly rich site for examining how music making might nuance our understanding of nationalism, regionalism, transnationalism, and transregionalism. So I would like to end this brief talk by thanking those people who have made the publication of the book and the running of today's event possible. I would like to begin by expressing my heartfelt gratitude to my 2 co-editors, Matthew and Salwa, for their excellent work and fine-grained observations on my own editorial contribution to the volume. I have learned so much from you both throughout the process, and I hope you will forgive my limitations. I would also like to thank all our contributors for their excellent work and their patience with our endless requests for changes and updates. I always think that co-editing and contributing to a collective volume provides excellent training in patience and perseverance. Last, I would like to thank Illinois University Press for supporting this project, particularly Laurie Matheson and the editorial team. Last, I would like to thank all the people that have made this event possible, starting by Michael Christoforidis and Kimberly da Costa Holton for participating and enlivening the conversation, and Heather Garnens for editorial assistance and organizing these events so efficiently.
I think I'm up next. My name is Kimberly DaCosta Holton. I'm a professor at the University, at Rutgers University, professor of Portuguese Studies. It is such a pleasure to be a part of this book launch. I want to thank the editors for their invitation and thank University of Illinois Press for organizing this. It's been a very stimulating and nourishing 2 weeks reading this book in its entirety and thinking about what to say about it. It is, I believe, a major contribution to the field of not just music studies and ethnomusicology, but other fields as well, for a variety of reasons. So I'm going to just start with a kind of a greatest hits type organization. I don't want to go over my time so that we have some time for Q&A. But the first is maybe the splashiest, I think, part of the contribution, which is, as the editors say in the introduction, a kind of a re-entrenched focus on the nation. And that in the face of the last several decades where all sorts of scholars predicted that the rise of globalism would chip away at the importance of the nation, but that hasn't happened. And to state that outright in the introduction, to have that as a point of departure for organizing the volume, I think is a very visionary strategy, and one that bears amazing fruit in the chapters, in the subsequent chapters. I think it's incredibly timely. We all know how long edited volumes take to get organized and to appear. I think Matthew was saying it started working on it in 2018, so that's 4 years. But there's a prescient anticipation of things that are happening and unfolding as we speak, thinking about the election just last week in Argentina and the rise of xenophobic insistence on a kind of disassociative belonging, an idea that we are who we are because we are not who you are, a rise in those types of sentiments, and an understanding and structuring of those sentiments using the nation as an organizing structure. So I feel like this volume is incredibly of the moment and incredibly important in bringing back something, a structure for socio-spatial understanding that was thought to be on its way out, but is new again in some ways. So I think that it's a pioneering framework for this and other reasons. I think that the periodization used in organizing the 4 sections, which is loosely chronological, makes a lot of sense and bolsters, parallels the rise of modernity and the importance of the relationship between music making and music consumption and the nation, and the subnation and the region and the municipality. I also appreciate the combining of a focus on Spain and Portugal. In other fields, related fields that are my subfields, such as literary studies, there's a lot of sort of complaining about the fact that there's not more dialogue between the literary production of Spain and Portugal, and lots of sort of vague plans for addressing that gap. But it hasn't come to fruition much. whereas in this volume, I feel like it addresses it insists upon a robust dialogue between these two countries. If we think about that famous pictorial map where Spain and Portugal are creatures that have their backs turned towards one another, this is a volume where the backs are not towards one another, they're facing each other, and they're in dialogue. The editors said in the introduction that this was not to be a comparative work. But what's interesting, there is one chapter that's explicitly comparative, but the other chapters that are case studies bring in, the case of the other country just, kind of naturally, and because it makes rhetorical and I think historiographical sense to do that. And so I feel like that's the robust dialogue between Spain and Portugal in this volume is a major contribution that is a pioneering approach compared to other fields of cultural production. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Also, I appreciate the insistence on moving beyond the dominance of fado and flamenco. I think there's such a rich array of genres covered in this volume that you don't normally see. I appreciate the fact that this is a volume that's published in English. It's going to, it's the only volume of its kind, I think, in English, and it's going to reach a very wide audience. And the specific chapters, when I was reading the case studies, especially those that were dealing with Estado Novo and the authoritarian regimes, I was reminded that just 25 years ago, a lot of the primary documents that related to these regimes were under lock and key, and scholars at the time had no other choice but to kind of read the silences, right? And to read these chapters that are so finely detailed, that are so so granular, right? Highly theorized, but so granular in their detail, is really so thrilling as a scholar that's worked in this field for a long time to see that, because it shows that, as Professor Salwa was saying, it's a new generation of scholars that are involved in this volume that have access to materials that were not available to scholars just 25 years ago. And so certainly for an English language audience, I believe this is a real unveiling, right, of material that has not been, that was not highly accessible. So I just want to congratulate the editors and the press for producing such an important work.
All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and play the video from Michael.
My thanks to Matthew for inviting me to take part in the launch of Music and the Making of Portugal and Spain, and my apologies for not joining you live online. Because of the tyranny of time zones, I think it would have been around 4 a.m. in the morning. This is a remarkable and magnificently curated volume, which, if I may say, is highly atypical of publications emanating from conferences. We all know what these look like, and I think I'm currently editing one of those. The editors deserve the highest praise for this achievement and for the fantastic introductory essay, and at the same time, an important scholarly contribution that provides a lucid and rigorous overview of the issues. I've been asked to speak briefly about the essays covering Spain in this book, which in and of themselves constitute a key contribution to our understanding of music's role in the shaping of nation and identity in Spain since the late 19th century. There's certainly nothing of this breadth and calibre in the Anglophone literature, and it will no doubt become set reading for Hispanic studies and Spanish music courses in academic institutions. I'm already revising our syllabus for the music of Spain offered here at the University of Melbourne. The first of these essays is Igor Contreras's The National Anthem and the Symbolic Construction of Francoist Spain. While it may seem really clear that a national anthem is at the heart of any nationalist enterprise involving music, here we have a really revelatory account of the competing national anthems. I think he discusses 4 in total, tied to political agendas, as well as their lyrics in early 20th century Spain. He does omit the one, I think, that they tried to get from Manuel de Falla, but he wasn't going to be writing one in 1937. In part 2, Sound Technologies and the Nation, there's a wonderful paper by Eva Moreda on recording Zarzuela Grande in Spain in the early days of phonograph and the gramophone. And as well as discussing and exploring nationalist issues relating to the recording of the Zarzuela Grande in the early 20th century, Eva provides a wonderful overview and synthesis of the 19th century debates on nationalism and the Zarzuela. In part 3, Negotiating the State, Nation and Region, there are actually 3 really interesting essays based on a number of different approaches. Diego García Peinazo, in his essay Towards a Critical Approach to Flamenco Hybridity in Post-Franco Spain, looks at issues of identity in rock andaluz of the transition and post-transition period of the late 70s. And there's a really intriguing discussion of questions of authenticity and Andalusian regionalism around the band The Storm, and in the latter part of the essay on rock andaluz as heritage in and of itself, and how different groups have tried to draw on this more recently. Hector Faute and Fernand del Val present an area that I knew very little about, which was indie music as a controversial space on Spanish identity, class, youth and discontent. And this focuses primarily on the 15th M movement of 2011 and music's associated in particular with middle-class youth. Finally, there's José Martí's chapter on Catalonia versus Spain, How Sonorous is Nationalism? Focusing on the 2017 protests, Josep manages to look at the whole of Catalonia and the ways in which even more historic repertories that dated from the late Franco period were brought to bear alongside more recent repertories in these manifestations. The final part of the book, Music, Heritageization and the State, we have a great introductory essay on intangible heritage in both the state regimes of Portugal and Spain. And this is followed by an essay by Cristina Cruces Roldan on flamenco heritage and the politics of identity. Flamenco's inclusion in UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage List in 2010 is explored in this essay, and there's a really fascinating discussion of flamenco heritage and the artistic community, in particular in relation to views of the Gitano communities associated with the flamenco artistic community. Finally, I'd like to muse on this book serving as a model for rethinking musical nationalism more broadly. Something that I alluded to in the blurb that I was asked to write for the book. And it's great to see a framework that goes beyond the composer-based or specific reception studies that are normally associated with questions of nationalism. Here we have a really new and fresh framework, especially in the way the editors have compiled or brought together a set of essays on a range of issues. Look, and it's undoubtedly of great relevance, the book, beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Most obviously, I would say, in relation to Latin America, because of the clear historical, cultural, and musical affinities. However, I think that this volume provides a very clear model for interrogating music in the formation of nation and identity in other Mediterranean countries or regions. Because of my own background, Greece comes to mind. And here we have affinities in political trajectory and even musical styles and questions of hybridity in the 20th century. I'd love to see something like this used as a model for that type of exploration of nationalism and identity. Thank you so much, Matthew, for your invitation, and to the editors. Congratulations, and to the contributors, of course. Congratulations on this wonderful volume being launched here today.
All right, so I would encourage people to go ahead and start putting questions in the Q&A box, or you can put them in the chat. We have about 15 minutes left. All right, so our first question comes from Michael Walsh, and he asks, what is missing? What would you include if you had more time?
I'm happy to jump in unless Salwa or someone want to first. Thank you, Michael, for this question. This is a very important question, and actually one I've been thinking about a little bit recently. A colleague of mine, upon seeing the text and from an email that I sent around a mailing list through the ethnomusicology mailing list, commented on the volume. It's really good. It's really interesting. I'm already looking forward to reading it. And then noted, I see that there's minority voices in those countries are missing. There's no discussion around things to do with race or migration or things, which of course, I mean, as an ethnomusicologist, that strikes me as actually quite obvious, I suppose, an obvious kind of limitation of the text, that when we consider national identity, one of the things that we need to take into account is how national identity might be problematized, might be challenged, might be diversified from things like migration, from minority communities and so on. And then it got me thinking that actually that is something that isn't covered in this book, really. There's a little bit in some chapters, particularly around the role of Gitanos, for example, the Roma community in flamenco in Christine Cruzes's chapter, but it's not a running theme throughout the book. And I sort of asked myself why that might be. I think partly that's due to the contributors that we had at the original conference, and the sorts of things, because it was an open call for papers, and the sorts of papers that we were having through, a lot of them were dealing with issues around dictatorship, around heritage regimes, sort of, I suppose, more top-down, you might say, phenomena, popular music and so on. So that kind of element of the minority voice, so to speak, was missing from the symposium as well. And actually thinking about it, I think that's something I may want to develop in the future. I could quite easily see a volume around music, race, and migration in contemporary Spain or in the contemporary Iberian Peninsula. So yeah, that's my response, Michael. I hope that kind of gives something there. I don't know if Samuel and Salwa wanted to build on that.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, thank you, Matthew. I think if I were to include something that we haven't discussed much in the book is the question of borders, how borders are experienced in places such as Extremadura, very near the Portuguese border, southern Galicia. So I'm sure from the other side of the border, how is the the Portuguese-Spanish border experienced musically? I guess out of personal ignorance, I haven't done much in terms of looking towards like current popular music genres that are trending, such as reggaeton in Spain, or to see if there's any projects involving collaboration with Portuguese artists that deserve discussion. And I mean, it's something that would be worth considering. I'm not aware of anything happening in that direction, but I also confess at the same time that I haven't done enough work in searching in that direction. But I think that the question of borders, how they are experienced locally, is something that would deserve perhaps not even just a chapter in the book, but a further section. But obviously, there's a few things that always need to be left out, unfortunately, because of questions of space.
Well, I'll just come back in on that, Samuel, because incidentally, I was just looking back at the original program of the symposium, and we did actually have a panel in there crossing borders through music. There are 3 papers there that were looking, for example, Manuel Dennis Silva, his research around musical exchanges between Portugal and Spain. And I seem to remember early conversations when we were putting together the volume and proposing it to the publisher. I think that was a casualty of the overall structure of the volume, I think, and it potentially being too long and what have you. So as you were talking, that just reminded me of the original thing that we had in the conference. But Salwa, I don't know if you wanted to add to. You're muted, Salwa.
You're muted.
Within the question of borders, the question of circulation, not only within the Iberian Peninsula, but extending to Spanish-speaking, Portuguese-speaking countries, other countries, and the implications on music making, with so many musical genres that really are created through cooperation between musicians coming, in the case of Portugal, for example, from Brazil, from Africa, and from Portugal. And I'm sure similar things are happening in Spain.
All right, so our next question comes from Mark, and he asks, do music streaming technologies or the internet emerge in the book?
Samuel, did you want to? You unmuted.
Well, I am muted because someone had to do something about the question. I'm not sure I have a very successful answer to this question, in the sense that, yes, it's not an area that we have explored a lot, perhaps because of the lack of awareness of any projects moving in this direction. I have to say, though, it's an extremely important question, the one you've asked, and how borders, well, not borders, actually how trans-regional, transnational relations are negotiated through, streaming, through the streaming of music is, I think, a fundamental question. And another important missing topic that moving forward, we do need to consider if we, I was going to say if we published a second book, but if we, in our own research, let's say, because publishing a second book is, we're sort of like out of breath at the moment, but who knows what the future might bring. Thank you for that question.
All right, so our next question comes from Kate, and she asks, are there plans to translate this volume to Portuguese and Spanish?
so far, at least for Portuguese, no, but it's an excellent idea. I think that the book should be available in both languages.
All right, so our next question comes from Adam, and he asks, what's the main takeaway of the volume in terms of criticizing the dominant Euro-white identity politics?
Sorry, go ahead, Matthew.
Just go on, Samuel. That's a difficult question.
I think so. I suppose the question of, say, ethnic diversity is not one that's it's not at the front of the book. It's a book that's trying to problematize other questions. But if there's anything that the book contributes to, and I'm anticipating that the answer is going to disappoint you. But if the book contributes in any way to, if I may read again, criticizing the dominant Euro-white identity politics, I'd say that what we're trying to do is question or we're trying to encourage rethinking the nation beyond what we're trying to do is get beyond a situation in which we think the nation based on Central European models and then apply to other geographies. So we're trying to perhaps reconsider the use of Portugal and Spain as European peripheries at the same time. Beyond that, the volume does not try to address the question of ethnic diversity or state racism or exclusion in Spain and Portugal. This is an important topic of our research, of all three co-editors, and of the work of many of the contributors, but it's not one of the main goals of the volume, I guess.
All right, our next question comes from Kate, and she asks, how have the authors navigated localized insistence on differences between Spain and Portugal? I appreciate that Professor Llano has already addressed this to some extent in his opening remarks, so perhaps the editors could expand on this. In my experience, researching in Portugal, my friends and research interlocutors tended to emphasize the ways in which Spain and Portugal were unique and had distinct cultural, linguistic, and musical trajectories, perhaps reflecting the success of various nationalist projects.
I think that one of the things that the book shows, and certainly we tried, is precisely how the histories, the processes, and even some of the musics intersect rather than stand on their own. So I think that the book in a way calls attention to that it is very productive to look at these intersections, to look at how these two spaces are interwoven historically and even contemporaneously.
I think it's important as well to stress, as Samuel, I think, did in his introduction, that this isn't meant to be a comparative approach. It's we're not comparing here between these two countries, because that brings with it, as Samuel said, different categories of difference and so on. So what we've tried to do is use, I suppose, those similarities, those shared sort of political and historical characteristics of the two countries as a jumping off point. To consider, say, current debates around nationalism, around identity, around heritage, in a region that is often peripheralized in scholarship around these topics. So, yeah, I hope that in some way addresses the question. I don't know, someone, if you wanted to add at all.
No, I think you've both very successfully answered the question, really. I mean, it's getting beyond the comparative issue, but yeah, I mean, not to undermine the cultural specificities of Spain and Portugal, or within two countries, but yeah, it's a difficult balance to achieve, no? When you're focusing on transference of on cultural processes that that question and transcend national and regional borders, and at the same time try to keep an eye on differences. It's a difficult balance to achieve. We've tried to do our best in the volume. It's obviously for readers to judge whether that's been achieved successfully. Mm-hmm.
All right, our next question comes from Ava, who asks, how do you think the future looks like for the study of Spanish Portuguese music outside the peninsula and outside Hispanic Portuguese studies departments? Do you think it might benefit from the renewed study in global musicology?
I think that the future looks very bright given the number of young people really doing wonderful work and work that really engages with current questions. This book just reflects a very, very tiny and specific focus, but there is much more. And I hope that one of the things that the book does is to call attention to all the good work that is being done, both within Spanish and Portuguese institutions, and also in other academic contexts in the US and in Europe, mainly. However, ethnomusicology and historical musicology have come a long way. That one of the things that this book tries to do is precisely to call attention to the work done, and more scholars from both countries are publishing in English, publishing international journals. So I think that my outlook for the future is an optimistic one.
I think that's a great question, Eba. And obviously, when thinking about, I think there's a lot of potential in global music history as I suppose I could call it an emerging discipline, although, global history is by no means an emerging discipline. But obviously, when doing what you suggest, the topic that is going to instantly come up is that of colonialism. And I think it's a difficult one. And the risk is always of falling into the trap of setting Spanish and Portuguese colonialism in perspective. Obviously, the goal needs to be to decolonize, and it's a difficult one, and but I think it's an extremely interesting one, and there's obviously a lot of avenues to explore, regarding this matter, and I think it's a very provocative question in the good sense of the word.
All right, our next question comes from Rachel, who asks, says, congratulations on this volume. I can't wait to read it. Going back to what Professor Holton mentioned about emphasizing the still relevant frame of the nation in the face of globalization, how do the contributors maintain the importance of more regionalized, localized concerns while addressing the national? Was this a balance the editorial team sought out as they planned the text?
Is it possible to see that and write it? I'm not seeing it in the chat.
It's on the Q&A.
Yeah, it's in the Q&A box. And I put it in the answered column. If you open that up, it'll be down at the bottom.
I was hoping that Matthew would jump in because his whole research career is about this question. I don't want to put you on the spot, Matthew. I'm just saying that Matthew has a very long trajectory of working precisely on the tensions between regionalism and nationalism, and that was the pretty much the topic of his first book on flamenco. And while I may not be able to give you a formula on how we've been trying to achieve that balance, it has been the the focus of the conference of 2016, from which these books started, to keep a balance between the focus on the nation and the region. What I mean to say is that yes, it's been pretty much it's been in this book's very first seed. It's been our very obsession to try to achieve that balance, but also, if I am fair to the book, to try to not regard nation and region as two terms of a binary opposition, but rather to actually transcend that, to try to find different ways of conceiving of this relationship, or rather to actually find ways in which this relationship is problematized in the musical projects that we discuss in the different case studies.
Well, I think you've answered that very well. I was taking a long time to digest the question, I think, at this time in the evening. Yeah, as Samuel says, I mean, this is really the sort of germ, I think, of the original idea of this conference. I mean, so much of my work is focused on sort of problematizing the notion of nation within Spain from a regional level, specifically in Andalusia, and how flamenco has sort of been caught up with Andalusian identity politics in the region, and actually how we may see a kind of fragmented picture of regionalism itself, with kind of competing localisms and what have you. So this kind of shifting scale from local through the subnational, regional to the national and beyond is kind of very much something that characterizes the volume. With the kind of topical nature that Kimberly pointed to, I'm glad that she raised that in her introduction, in a sort of summary of her view of the text. Because I think this is very much one of the things that we wanted to highlight, and I'm glad that even after sort of 5-6 years of this book taking to come to fruition, it still does have that topical character, and that's certainly true in this idea of a kind of tension between regional and national levels. Just to give an example, in a course that I run on music, film, visual culture, and nationalism, it's an interdisciplinary course that looks at music, film, and visual culture in Spain since the late 19th century to the present day. And one of the lectures is around regional identities and the sort of problematizing the nation. And I've actually set Josep Marti's chapter around sort of Catalan versus Spanish sonic protest, essentially around the failed referendum in 2017. And when we were discussing that text in the seminar recently, that was in the same week in which things had flared up again in Spain, with the amnesty deal, of course, that PSOE had given to Catalan politicians in exile and so on. So even at this point, it's still very topical, and that particular chapter enabled us to have a wider conversation about recent politics in Spain and the ways in which music and sound might intersect with those politics. So thank you for the question. I think it really cuts to the heart of the volume.
If I may add, in Portugal, the question of region and nation is posed in very different terms, but the chapter on the Alentejo brings out, I think, some of the issues, at least for that region, and the importance of music in negotiating region and nation.
All right, so we have one final question from Genevieve, who wants to know how the pandemic changed your mindsets, priorities, and understandings when crafting the volume.
Sorry, may I ask if this question is in reference specifically to the book, or to how we conceived the book, or in terms of on a more theoretical level as to how we conceive of questions about. So is it more about the planning of the book, or about how we conceive of the relationship between the nation and the region, more theoretical terms?
He says perhaps both.
It's a difficult one to answer. I mean, I think the volume was so far underway. I think when the pandemic happened, the book had already been conceived, its structure had been set, had been accepted by the press, and we'd started to sort of receive initial drafts, and we were in the long process of, you know, working through drafts, of returning drafts, of editing and re-editing, and so on and so forth. So I think in that sense there wasn't really any impact, I think, on the structure and outlook of the book. I mean, in terms of my own research, I've certainly had impacts during the pandemic. I've been running a European Research Council funded project, whereby we were heavily affected, the research team, by the pandemic, and it impacted on our ability to do field work and archival work and so on, and that necessitated a certain kind of reworking and rethinking of methodological approaches and so on. But I don't see that impact on this text. But I think Samuel and Salwa may have other things to say.
Well, one of the things is that it made us stay home and concentrate on the editorial process more than anything else, I think.
Yes, that's very true. Maybe it would have been another 2 years longer if it weren't for the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the sort of intellectual or impact on my sort of beliefs about, you know, the sort of theoretical foundations of the book, I didn't have any impact in the sense that I've not been doing any readings about, you know, about the pandemic from a theoretical point of view, and how it's transformed perceptions of national of the transnational. It would be, you know, a very interesting. I think it's a very interesting question and something very interesting to explore, but it's sort of like beyond our capacity. And we were reacting more to, I mean, considering the pandemic from a practical point of view, but reacting more to the challenges of putting together a project that began a few years ago. So I don't think we were factoring in the pandemic into the, how do you call it, the build of the book, no, how it's built.
All right, so it looks like we are just about out of time. Do you have any final thoughts before we go?
No, just to extend a thank you to Heather again for organising, to Kimberly and Michael for taking part, and for everybody who's come along and made this such a great discussion with all these wonderful questions and comments. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you everyone, and Heather, Kim, and Michael, and all of you who have come this afternoon and joined us on this occasion. Thank you so much, and thank you for the questions. They really are very stimulating to think about for future projects, whether together or separately or in other collaborative projects.
All right, well, as a reminder, if you'd like to pick up a copy of the book, you can use promo code HOLIDAY50 to get 50% off during our holiday sale, which ends December 31st. Thank you again for attending our event today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.